yes, hello. I'm Josh, and I'm here to talk about React today. So it's got the subtitle, "A Trip to Russia Isn't All It Seems." So you'll see why as we kind of go through it. But we recently had to use a new tool. I'm going to tell you why we needed it and how we figured out that React was going to be the tool for us. So let's get into it. So I work for a company called 383, and we're a customer experience studio based in the UK. And we help brands create exceptional experiences driven by innovative digital products, which sounds nice, but essentially we make cool stuff for people to kind of grow their brands. And we work with a load of clients who are kind of, fairly big. So when we decide that we need a new tool, we don't take it on lightly. We serve upwards of millions of customers per day. So we kind of don't dive into it and just say, oh, here is a new JavaScript framework, let's play with it, let's put it out in production and see what happens. Like, it's not a decision we generally take lightly. We need a lot of thought, make sure that we can scale it, make sure it will stand up to the tests. So we had a client come to us, and they wanted to effectively market their travel product to Russian speakers in their native country. So effectively, they wanted a e-commerce site for Russian people. And we're not from Russia, we don't speak Russian, we're not particularly experts on Russia, but what we are good at is user research and trying to figure out what customers want and what will get them to purchase stuff in a way that they're happy, that it's good for both our client and the end user. So we set about doing some desk research, trying to figure out what do websites in Russia look like. Presumably they're similar to the rest of the world, and broadly they are. So this is Yandex, which is their biggest search engine. It's kind of similar to Google, fairly straightforward, basic design. This is mail.ru, which is an email site, news, social. I read that 80% of Russian people in general visit this site once per day, so that's quite a lot. But again, it's a really straightforward, simple design with black text, white background and blue links. And this is vContact, which is their social network equivalent to Facebook. And actually, this reminds me of Facebook's design from about 10 years ago. It's really simple. We see exactly the same simple design. So at this point, we were thinking, great, this is going to be like a one-week project. We're going to get it done because it's going to be a really straightforward design. So we started wireframing it, putting it out, and testing it with real users. Even in just like the paper wireframe stage, we gave it to users and said, can you find the information you want based on these different screens? Do you feel like you're going to be able to use it? Do you feel like you're going to trust what it is you're buying? Because that was something that came out of some user research that we did before we started, was that Russian people really feel that they've got to trust a website before they'll purchase from it, like far greater than Europe and America. We're far more cavalier about our attitudes to purchasing stuff online than Russian people. So we were doing all this stuff, and the design was growing, and it was kind of getting out of control, and it wasn't anything like what we'd expected it to look like. So when it came to the visual design, this is actually what it looked like. Which is the video? Cool. So you'll notice that it's not the straightforward white background with black text and blue links. In fact, there's a lot of images. And actually, there's a lot of nested content. So as we click on this card here to expand all this content, we've got a gallery of images. And the images sit on these slides. So there's several slides here with several images on each one. And this is obviously like a much bigger job to kind of manage, and we weren't really sure why, but obviously doing the user testing, figuring out this is actually what was performing well with the audience. So, like what was a 1-week job turned into like a 6-month job. So that's the nature of the beast. But we set about trying to figure out how we would actually build this. And in particular, as I say, this is the component that was really causing us some trouble because of the nested content that was going on. So why is this difficult? Well, there's a number of reasons. We had some constraints that we had to work within. The client was already familiar with WordPress. It was going to be our default CMS. And actually, we really like WordPress as a CMS because it requires zero buy-in from the clients. They understand what it is. They know what they're getting when they have it. And it's really easy to find developers for. So they're not tied into a proprietary system that we've built. We just extend WordPress, and if they want to pick it up and take it somewhere else in the future, they can. So they have zero qualms about doing it. They're not worried about it. Obviously, all the pages are built on the server side, but then there's an awful lot going on the client side as well as the users interacting with it. And we're talking about the admin system here. This isn't even building the front end of it. The front end was relatively straightforward in the end. But in order to get the data into the admin was going to be a massive challenge for us. And also, we wanted to make sure that it was reusable for other projects, right? If we're going to spend time building this, we want to make sure that we can pick it up and put it into a different project and it's going to work just the same. We don't want to have a specific form, like this is the way that this form is built. We want to make it general enough that it will run off a config, and we can build a new config for it in a different site and it'll work exactly the same. So I just want you to bear this kind of data representation in mind as we go through. We've got a card which can have 0 or more slides attached to it, and the images, slides can have 0 or more images. So of course we could do something, only in PHP, only use WordPress stuff where you post the form off and to add a new row, for instance, or add a new image. But that's going to be really clunky and going to take a lot of time for the people to use the admin system. Or we could build something in like vanilla JavaScript and figure out, how to do the interactions there. But that was going to be a lot of work for us. We really needed to simplify it for us, because otherwise we'd be there, we'd still be there today building it. So the first thing that springs to mind is Backbone, which is a great JavaScript framework. We've used it on a bunch of projects. And Backbone is already built into WordPress. WordPress admin uses Backbone. So it's really lightweight, already used by WordPress, so that we know it's there, we know it's going to play nicely with everything. And it's very versatile, by which I mean it's not highly opinionated. If we wanted to do something unusual with it, then it wouldn't have a problem. We wouldn't be forced into a way of doing things. However, there's no data binding, so as we're manipulating this and we're adding an image row, for instance, to that slide, we'd have to manually change the state and transition between those states and say, right, add this row here, add this markup here. And that was something that we felt like it wasn't going to be a good idea. And also, nested models in Backbone are hard. I know that there's ways around it and that people are trying to do some cool stuff with it. But this is because of the event-driven nature of Backbone. It just doesn't play nicely with the nested models. And obviously, we're working with quite deeply nested models. So we ruled out Backbone and thought, right, we're going to have to go somewhere else, find a different tool. So next, we came across Angular, which we've spent a lot of time working with. It's obviously a very hot framework. A lot of people use it, and it's kind of mature. And it's really good because it enables fast development once you're comfortable with it. It enables easy testability because it's got this dependency injection system. So this was starting to look like it could really work. We could figure out a way of having like an Angular system in WordPress. Although it did obviously feel pretty heavyweight doing that. However, there's some cons. Scopes are really hard to debug. So if you've worked with Angular, you'll know what the scopes are, but essentially you're passing the data around between, throughout the system using these scopes. And actually, they're really hard to debug, trying to figure out where the changes were made, where the data's come from. It's just, impossible, especially in a quite complex system. And also, Angular really is all or nothing. So, if you're building an Angular one-page app, you use Angular and basically nothing else. It just doesn't really play nicely with anything. Now, WordPress has a bunch of stuff in it already, such as the media picker. That is a JavaScript component that already exists. You click on it, it pops up like a light box, and you can choose your image, and it would add it to the post. we didn't really want to have to rebuild that. That seemed like unnecessary overhead at the time. So again, we ruled Angular out. We didn't like the fact that it was all or nothing. So then we started to think about React. Now, we'd never used React before, and in fact, we didn't know how to do React. It was going to require some training to get up to speed and figure out how to do it. But what we did know about React is that it's a library developed by Facebook, released in 2013, and it's only just reaching maturity. So things like Angular and Backbone have been around for quite some time, and there's a lot of tools out there. It's really stable, and they're really great. But React, it kind of worried us that this was only starting to reach maturity, until we figured out that Facebook used the beta versions from GitHub on facebook.com. So as you're clicking around and liking stuff and chatting with people, that is probably a beta version of the most recent React library. So that filled us with some confidence that we would be able to use it and that it wasn't going to be pulled out from under us. So I haven't got the version number on here, but this is obviously my profile page or whatever, and this is a little inspector so you can see all the React components. So I've highlighted here the friends list on the right, or the chat list as they call it. And there's a bunch of other stuff here. So everything on this page is basically React, which is cool. So React is not a full framework. Actually, it's a view library. It's the view in Model View Controller. And it will play really nicely with other frameworks. So if you already had an existing Angular app and you wanted to use React as the view library, then that's perfectly okay. People are going to be cool with that. And it's built from these components. So when I say component, what I mean is that the behavior and the visualization come together, and you kind of inject some data into it, and it becomes this full component. It's not a true web component, as in the standard that there was a talk on earlier, but it's getting it's along the similar lines, and it's getting to be pretty similar. Bearing that in mind, there is a React routing library. So if you wanted to make a one-page app completely in React, then that's perfectly possible because there's a React routing library. So it will look at the URL, figure out which page and which screen it should be showing, and it will do that. And actually, there's a suggested application architecture. Facebook have taken the event-based nature of JavaScript and said, Model View Controller doesn't work for us anymore. There's a better way of doing this. So I'm going to touch on this a little bit later, but actually this was really, really powerful. Obviously, we use Model View Controller as our natural paradigm, so that's what we initially jumped to when we were comparing it to other things. But it's not necessarily the best way of doing it. The other stuff we knew about React was it had this kind of XML-like syntax, whereas maybe you could kind of define these components or tags or whatever, put them on a page, and they would work. And that like I say, you can inject the data into it. So here we've got this scorecard component, and we've got the game scores, which might be an array or whatever, but basically you pass game scores into the scoreboard, and the scoreboard would build itself out with as many rows as it needed in order to display that data. So bearing in mind this data visualization that we saw earlier, where we've got a card with 0 more slides, slides with 0 more images, we were thinking maybe the best case would be something like this, where we could define maybe like a panel that kind of contained everything, you injected the data into it, and then you could have a card, a slide, and an image inside. And this means that we could take this, the library that we were building, put it into a different project, and we could have a different, a different form with different components on the inside, but we'd built all the hard stuff. Now this is the admin as it eventually turned out. So as you can see, it's WordPress with some extra stuff. But we click add a row for the images here, click on choose an image, and apologies for the slow Wi-Fi, but this is WordPress's image picker. And it works in exactly the same way. We've not had to change any of WordPress's default stuff. We've just tied into what was already there, which we found really useful. And it meant that we weren't reinventing the wheel. And it meant that if we were ever to move away from WordPress, if we did decide that actually this product was big enough or there was a need to have its own custom admin, we could build that in a different way and bring this along with us because it already existed. Okay, so let's get into actually coding React. So this XML-like syntax that we talked about is JSX, which is a JavaScript extension syntax to. So here at the top, we're defining the app variable, and we've got hello as the component, and then we're passing in the data subject equals world. Perfect. But this just gets compiled down to regular JavaScript. You can do it as like an offline build process once, as you're working away before you kind of push it up to the server or commit it in or whatever. You could do it in your CI server and build it there, or you can actually do it on the page as well, so it can be interpreted sort of just in time on the page. So these two snippets are identical. In the second one, all we have is kind of the additional thing as it's been expanded out. We try and create an element, pass in the hello component, the data, which again is just subject equals world, and then this null on the third line represents any child elements. So if we wanted to nest other things within this hello world element, then they would appear as an array on that third line, and we would know what the children were going to be. But what is this hello component? Well, we create this just by creating a regular JavaScript object. And as long as it's got a render method, then we can pass it into react.create class and get back that component. So here, this is very simple. All we're doing is creating some h1 tags, saying hello, and then outputting the subject property that we passed in. But notice that there's no quotation marks around the h1. This isn't a string. We're not building up an HTML string here. These themselves are JSX components. So we're building up this great big representation of the view. And that's entirely independent of the DOM, which turns out to be really useful later. So here, if we want to actually put it on the page, we just get an element by ID, as you would normally, give it your React component, and it would, flesh it out on the screen, and it would look great. So that's fine. But what about if we wanted to update an element? We wanted to change it in place on the fly. So React components have an internal state. So we have a getInitialState method, where here we're returning like is false for this like button. And anytime the state is altered, the component marks itself as dirty and re-renders. So if we implement a click handler, then we can say, right, anytime this click handler is invoked, we want to set the state to be toggle what is already there. And our render method will just create a button that has a click handler that we've just defined, and the text you either like or haven't liked this. So this is really interesting because the browser DOM is obviously very slow. If we were manipulating this in place every time, if every time we had to do something, we had to re-render the entire document, that would be incredibly slow. It's a well-known fact that just changing stuff in the DOM is really inefficient. What React have created what they call the virtual DOM, which is this great big representation of the entire view in memory. And they make the changes to the virtual DOM, compute any differences between what is currently there and the virtual DOM, and only re-render those bits that are completely different. And actually, they do clever stuff like cache. If your parent has changed slightly, but only one of the children has changed, it will use a cached version of the other two children. So let's get into a slightly simplified example, but essentially we're going to end up with exactly the same, functionality as what we built in the admin. So instead of slides and cards, we're going to talk about countries and cities because they're slightly easier to think about. So we have a planet panel where we pass in, the city data. And we create a group for the countries, which has a single text field, and that's the country name. We have a group for cities within that group, where you put the city name and the population. So as this builds out, it ends up looking, pretty similar to the admin that we built. I hope you'll agree. But this should be easier to follow. So let's walk through exactly what's required. So if we create the group component, let's start with the initial state. We check to see if someone's already given us data, and if so, we use that as as the rows for this group. And if not, we just create the rows as being an empty array. To add a new row is really straightforward as well. All we need to do is append an additional object into the rows array. So initially we'll have 0 if no data has been given to us, and then we'll have 1 row after we've clicked the add new row. So the render method for this component looks a bit like this. We compute all of the row nodes that we need from the data. So here what we do is create a row node and then give it all of the children. So whereas originally we defined that we had a group for the cities and that group had 2 text fields in it, all we do is pass those text fields straight into the row. So every row is going to be identical, and we're not tied into the definition of the definition of this specific form. We can change it and tweak it and pass it around, and then we've got the reusability that we wanted. And then we create a simple div, give it a title, the row nodes, and then an additional row, which is the add button, and we attach that to the add new row click handler. So all of this expands out to just be regular HTML, which is great. There's nothing weird going on behind the scenes. We don't have to understand what's going on. We don't have to go to the people writing the CSS for this and say, right, now you need to understand a bunch of tools here that are different to what you're used to. All they have to do is look at HTML exactly the same as they've done before. Now I've slightly tweaked the example because I'm not passing in the field names, but we basically just built up the field names. They know exactly where they are in the hierarchy. You can address an individual text field, which means when we post this form, PHP or whatever can understand what's coming through and just save it as it normally would. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you are sat there thinking, stateful components, that seems like a bad idea. It works in this case because all we're doing is building up this HTML form. But if we wanted to do something more complicated, such as start reordering the list, then that obviously gets pretty tricky. What do we do? Give each row knowledge of all the other rows? Do we give it knowledge of the parent row and have it say, right, I need to move, but I need to swap places with this other row? Like, obviously that starts getting really confusing. And that's where this model view controller paradigm breaks down. We have models passing data to views, views writing data back to the models. Maybe the models themselves are changing data in the other models. And everything just gets really confusing and hard to deal with. And actually, if you're working on a big team, then having to have knowledge of all of these interactions and where the data is changing and where it's being passed to becomes a burden that you shouldn't have to deal with. It's quite interesting that Facebook started this with the, they formulated this library because they needed something to deal with the chat notification icon. So originally, when the little one popped up to say you have a new message, that was pretty tricky to implement on each and every page that required it. Whoever was building the page or the component or whatever had to understand how that chat icon worked. And that was something that they weren't willing to do. They didn't need to understand it. So instead, by creating the React component, where everything is self-contained and there's an efficient use of this data, where we're not doing this crazy stuff, then all you'd have to do is understand that there is a component which is the chat notification icon, and then you can drop it onto your page without having to understand how to wire it up and what is going on behind the scenes. So this leads us to Flux, which is the application architecture that Facebook have suggested using when you're using React. So instead of models, we keep our data in a store. The store will pass data to the views, and the views, in turn, create actions. So if you want to change the view, if you edit some data, or you want to add a new row, that sort of thing, then you create an action. That action is passed to a dispatcher, and the dispatcher goes back to the store and updates it. So you notice we get this one-way flow of data, which is pretty cool, because it means that I only need to understand one of these arrows at a time. If my job is to understand how I pass the data from the store to the view, then I can do that really easily. There's only one arrow I need to understand. Similarly, with the behaviors in the view, all I have to do is understand creating these actions. The dispatcher itself handles itself because it just passes it straight back to the store. So Flux is an idea rather than a library, and there's several implementations of it. We like Redux because it has pure functions with no side effects. So it's slightly different to this in that you don't create an action, you pass data to one of these pure functions and it will go and update the store. But the idea is essentially the same, that you have a one-way flow of data. And all of this means that it's not just for the browser. Because we've built up this representation of the view, and it's entirely independent of the browser DOM. We don't have to say, right, this is an H1 tag on this platform, but actually it needs to be something different on a different platform. We can write it once and use it on any device. And this is called React Native. So I'm not going to go into React Native itself, but essentially what you need to understand is that if you've created all of these components once through the web, and all of your pages are built up of the components, then you could pass that page to, say, an iOS app, and the iOS app just needs to understand how to implement those components. The actual document markup would be exactly the same, which we think is really, really powerful. Especially when it comes to things like, the Apple TV, for instance. Now, this is Apple's own app, and I don't think they did implement it using React. But if you were to create an app for the Apple TV and you wanted this kind of interaction, then you could use React or React Native. And certainly you can use the ideas that we've taken from React to implement it. We don't want to have to deal with the transitions between each of these cards. We don't want to say, right, moving from this one to this one, you grow and you shrink. It's not as simple as, when we have a mouse and we point at something and we let the CSS take care of that. We're sat across the room and we're using, the controller to sort of swipe. So we have to keep track of, which of these is highlighted and which one is going to be next. And what happens if we swipe down and we go to the next row? They're not insolvable problems by any stretch, but they are quite complex to deal with, especially using that model view controller paradigm. We're starting to write websites and web apps for a wide range of browsers now. We can't just go for the desktop browser. We have to consider mobiles and cars and TVs and everything in between. So we're having to adapt our tools. And we really found that React has changed our way of thinking. And it's allowed us to approach these problems with better knowledge of what's going to happen. So in summary, we found that React was really easy to develop sophisticated interfaces from simple components. We found that it was really reusable because we split the data from the presentation. And that presentation had things like the behaviors in it, which is great. So we could take that, use it in a different system. And it's also reusable in the sense that we've built the page, built the markup, and we can take it to other devices. And there's a dramatically less amount of work to do because all we need to say is, right, this is what this component looks like. This is what this component looks like. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah. I can go back and show some of the examples if I rush through them a little bit. We seem to be ahead of schedule.
Great talk. Just a small question. How do you test the stuff? So is it easy to test in React or?
Yeah, so it's pretty easy to test. Facebook have provided a bunch of tools that will allow you to do unit testing and everything. It's not as straightforward as other platforms, but it's definitely not impossible, and you can definitely build it into your workflow.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your talk.
Cheers, guys.